Thank you, Judd. You're too kind. You're too kind, my friend. I'm excited to talk about something today with biblical justice that is so critically important in our society with all of the arguments. A lot of what you hear in politics or online comes from a place of misunderstanding what justice is, not even agreeing what justice is. And as believers, we need to start by grounding ourselves in what biblical justice means. It's probably not what you think, no matter where you're coming from. And that's what we're going to talk about today. But before I get into it, I want to start with a story. This is a story about a man who lived in the Middle East a long time ago, a man named Onan, O-N-A-N. Now, at the time that Onan was alive, women had no rights. And when I say they had no rights, I mean they had no rights. Like if you were a woman, you lived under your dad's care, you did not get to choose who you married, you got married to somebody, then that person was in charge of you. And if that person died and you didn't have a male son, then you had no protection. So what they had in that society was a legal principle that said, okay, that man's, your husband, your dead husband's brother could come over to your house and sleep with you as many times as it took for you to have a son. And then that son would inherit his father's things. Until that time, the brother was in charge. And the son then inherited and took over, and you could lead the house until he was of age. So Onan was the younger son in the family, which means that when his dad died, his older brother got 2/3 of the estate, and Onan got 1/3 of the estate. That's the way they did things back then. And Onan's older brother, Onan goes on, gets married, has kids, all that, but his older brother can't have kids, and his older brother dies. So his sister-in-law, what he should do by the legal principles of their day is go and sleep with her, impregnate her, take care of her until the kid is born, and then she will be secure. But Onan says, you know what? If she never has a son, all that money comes to me as the nearest male relative. So what he did is he went over to her place, he slept with her, but then he pulled out right before the end so that he got to sleep with her and he got to be seen going into her house and he got to plausibly claim that he'd done his job and that she simply wasn't able to bear sons. And then he gets to keep the money too. Not a nice guy, it turns out, Onan. Not the hero of our story. And God killed him for it. He said, that is unjust, and he slew him. And that makes sense to us, right? By the way, this is in the Bible, so it's okay that I'm telling a rather risque story or a seemingly risque story. It's in the Bible. God killed him, and that makes sense to us, right? I mean, it's certainly unjust. But here's the thing. In the Mosaic Law, talking to these same people very shortly after, God said to them, hey, if you're married to your wife, as Onan was, you shouldn't be sleeping with anybody else. And if your brother's widow is available, you shouldn't be sleeping with her. And if you do that, you deserve death because that's unjust. So, which is it? Was it unjust for Onan to sleep with her or unjust not to? Why does God give two seemingly different commands? And I tell that story because it illustrates the heart of the problem that a lot of Christians have today as we deal with the social justice issues of our day and the political issues of our day, because we are told in Micah, very famously, right, that God doesn't ask much of us. He wants us to be humble. He wants us to love mercy, and he wants us to do justice. And we say, great, we're supposed to do justice. Now, what is it? And you can look at the Bible and you can pull a verse out of one context and you can pull a verse out of another context and you can get different answers. And that's what you see among Christians today as they try to navigate our current political culture, that we come into these debates with preconceived notions, and then we go to the Bible to find the parts that agree with us, and we miss the big picture. What is the definition of justice from God's perspective? That's what we're going to talk about today. And today, to say that I'm going to have to hit this topic at a thin level is an understatement. I only have 4 30-minute sessions with you, and it literally is deep enough that I wrote a book on the subject. So Judd will either provide a link to the book or the book itself to you guys, so that if you hear something and you want to have more information, you can go to it. And actually each session here will line up with the chapters in the book directly so that you can follow it. So it provides all of the deep biblical background that you need for some of these statements. So let's start out by answering the question, what is justice? And before I can answer it specifically, I need to make sure that you understand a concept. In our world, we think of justice as adherence to the law, right? It's just to do what the law says. And so we view the law as prescriptive. What does that mean? It means that we think the job of the law is to describe a specific situation and then prescribe for us what should always be the result. And we would say that justice has been done if the law has been applied fairly, right? So if theft is defined this way and you have stolen, then you get this result. Injustice is if you get that result without breaking the law, or if you break the law and don't get that result. Make sense? It's prescriptive. It's a prescription. So the judges actually aren't making decisions about the law. Judges to us are people who manage the courtroom and make sure the rules are followed and the rules of evidence are followed. And that's so obvious to us that you might not even realize there are other options. But the Bible, and in fact, most societies throughout history, did not view law that way. In the ancient Near East, where the Bible was written, they would have said, that's crazy. You can't possibly write a series of laws accurate enough and perfect enough to describe every scenario with enough specificity that the result will always be just if you follow this prescription. They said that's crazy. The purpose of the judge is not to manage that. The purpose of the judge is to do judging, to look at the situation and apply the concept of justice to the result. So the purpose of the law is descriptive. When you read the Bible and you read the laws in the Mosaic Code and you read the laws given to Noah and you read the laws given to Adam and you read the laws of others, what you're seeing are descriptions of how justice applies in this scenario. And you're given descriptions so that you can understand what justice is in general and therefore apply it to your scenario. And actually, you know this, right? You know this even if you didn't know you know this, because you know that Solomon was once doing a child custody hearing and he threatened to cut a baby in half with a sword. And I don't think any of you think that's what the Bible's saying should happen in our courtrooms today. What it's saying is, hey, Solomon knew that justice looks like the child going to the mother who's going to love it. And therefore, he applied that scenario to achieve the just result. It's a little bit like Star Trek. You guys, if you've watched Star Trek, you know what I mean by the prime directive. If you haven't, what's wrong with you? You should. In Star Trek, you had these ships going out and exploring the galaxies. And they said, well, we can't possibly tell you how to respond in every possible scenario. So we're going to teach the captains and the crew a prime directive. And that prime directive was that you do not interfere with the natural development of any society that you come across. You're there to study, and you can aid them if they're being interfered with in a way that's not natural, but you let their natural progress happen as it did. And so the job of the captain was to understand that concept and apply it in the different situations. It's a little bit like a math equation, right? It's a little bit like a math equation. You have a single equation with a variable in it. And when you change the variable, you get a different answer, but the equation always stays the same. And that's the way the Bible views justice. Okay. In the Bible, justice is a single attribute that comes from God. We're going to get to this in a later session. It is a single, unchangeable attribute. But because our society is sinful in different ways from Brazil's society, from Europe's society, from Onan's society millennia ago, that concept of justice plays out differently in the different groups while they're still aiming for justice. You see this in the talks with Jesus all the time. I'll give you a perfect example. Jesus was talking to a group of rabbis in the book of Matthew, and the Pharisees came up to him and they said, "Hey, who's right in this debate over how divorce should happen?" And they lay out a scenario. You know, what Moses told us in the Bible that you can divorce a woman as long as you give her a certificate of divorce. And Jesus says, absolutely not. What God has put together, no man should separate. Now, is Jesus saying that the law is wrong? No. He said, Moses gave you that because of the hardness of your hearts. You see, at Moses' day, women were simply left aside. A man would just get up, take his stuff and leave. Or he would simply take a woman, put her on a horse and say, go that way, hope you have luck, I'm marrying someone else. There was no legal protection at all. And so Moses said, hey, this isn't right. You shouldn't be separating from people, but with the way it's going now, let me put a divorce in place so that there's at least a legal process that protects the woman and gives her certain rights when she gets divorced. That was a step toward justice from Moses' day. But in Jesus' day, everyone in the Roman Empire had those divorce rights already. And the people, the Pharisees, were abusing Moses' command. There are records from that time of men filling out certificates of divorce and divorcing their wives because she burned the breakfast, which I think all of us who are married would know if we applied that today, none of us would survive the first year of marriage, right? All marriages would last like a week because none of us know what we're doing when we get married, yeah? So Jesus says, no. In our scenario, what's just is for what God joined together to last forever. Now, in Moses' time, a divorce certificate was a step towards that. But in our time, in his time, a certificate of divorce was a step away from that. Same goal, same justice, different applications. What Jesus is saying is that justice, the laws of the Bible are descriptive, and the goal is actually justice, not those particular laws. So it doesn't mean that the Bible or that justice is subjective. I want to make sure you hear me clearly. I'm saying there is an absolutely objective justice. It's what we're going to study for the next couple hours. But it also means that our faith is a practical faith. Ours is not a theoretical faith. Ours is a down in the mud with the sinner's faith, a hospital for sinners that we get down to where people are struggling and we help them through it. And because your struggles are different than my struggles, the prescription is different. Just like we wouldn't prescribe lisinopril for someone with a broken bone, right? It doesn't help in that case. You have to choose your prescription to match what's going on if you want to get healthy. But healthy is objective. Healthy is just. So that's what we're going to talk about today as we go through this. What we're going to try to find and what I'm going to propose to you is what I'm teaching you today is what we're looking for, which is the prime directive of biblical justice. The concept that if you internalize it and learn it, you will be able to apply to a variety of situations and always be confident that you're doing the will of God. And that prime directive is this. Biblical justice is the restoration of image bearers by serving as the prophets of society and putting God's mercy into action. That's a mouthful. That's okay. We're going to spend the next couple hours breaking it down. So in each session, we're going to go through one of the key words of that statement so that you understand it all, okay? And we're going to start by talking about this first word, restoration. Justice is the restoration of God's image bearers. Okay. When people talk about justice in America, what do they mean? When they say justice for Breonna Taylor, justice for George Floyd, what do we mean? Justice for African Americans, justice for unborn babies. What do people mean when they use the word justice? What they mean is typically one of three things. The first one is distributive justice. It's Robin Hood that you see up there, right? We're going to take what one person has too much of, and we're going to give it to someone who doesn't have enough. That's what one group of people think of. Distributing things fairly and evenly so that everyone has the same, or at least close to the same, is just. The next one is procedural, like we see here with To Kill a Mockingbird, which if you haven't seen it and read it, you're wrong and you should do that. Procedural means we're going to make sure that the laws are applied fairly and equally. If we are equal before the law, then justice has happened. And then finally, we talk about retributive justice, which is John Wick, if you can't see it there, who kills like 1 million people because someone, took his dog or whatever. Or Taken, or any other of the countless movies that deal in retributive justice, where you are wronged and therefore I am going to eye for an eye it. I am going to go out and make things right physically, right? Now, all of these show up in the conversations about justice today. None of them are biblical justice in and of themselves. They show up in the Bible occasionally as a method to achieve justice. There may be times that you have to distribute things to achieve justice. There may be times you have to fix laws. There may be times that retribution makes sense. Spoiler alert, Jesus took care of that last one for us. But none of them in and of themselves is justice. And I want you to notice something about all of these. What I want you to notice is, who is the focus? In distributive justice, the focus is on who has too much. In procedural justice, the focus is on the system and the laws. And in retributive justice, the focus is on the criminal. Do you see what's missing there? If you don't, I'll answer that question here in a minute. To answer that, I want to tell a story. I want to tell a story about a place called South Africa, you've heard of, and few countries in the world can give America a run for our money on the title of most white supremacy in their past, but South Africa is one of those. So from the 40s through the 90s, which is why these pictures are in color, they ran a system called apartheid. Now, even though most citizens in, what is apartheid? Even though most citizens in South Africa were black, white colonizers, the Dutch and the British predominantly, had come there, and most of the money had been theirs, right? They had accumulated most of the money. Guys like Elon Musk he's not a self-made billionaire, right? His parents owned a diamond mine in South Africa as one of the wealthy white caste. And what they did is, about the same time we were developing slavery, they went with a different but also horrible route of developing a caste system. So there was, the top caste was the whites. The second caste was the Asians and Indians. And the third caste was what they called the coloreds, that was mixed. And then the final caste were blacks. And so that developed over time. And then in the 40s, a nationalist party took over that cared a lot about nationalism, and they encoded this into law. They codified every citizen by their race and physically forced them into segregated regions separated by barbed wire and armed guards. 3.5 million black people were stripped of their family homes and their citizenships, and they were sent to ghettos. It's one of the largest mass relocations in the history of the world. And if that meant that your family was split because you had a black parent and a white parent, so be it. It was not uncommon after this change for mothers and fathers to never see their children. In 49, they outlawed mixed marriage. In 50, they outlawed sex outside of your race. In 53, they separated all public areas, even park benches. You had whites-only park benches and black park benches. And the South African whites did this in a way, it was not just brute force. It was like Bond villain level of super villainy thinking, right? What they did was they relocated all the blacks to 10 areas called Bantus. And then in 1959, they passed an act that said, we're going to allow black people to govern black people, which kind of sounds good, right? It sounds like maybe they're moving forward, but it's part of a plan. Then a few years later, they did some industrial work in those Bantu areas. They said, look, they've got some financial independence. And in 1970, they said, you can be citizens of your local self-government. And so a lot of people were saying, oh, okay, they're improving. They're freeing these people. But the actual purpose was by making them self-governing and by saying that you could participate in your governments, which are states of our national government, only the white people had votes for national law anymore. By moving them out and seeming to give them rights, what they actually did was subjugate and steal all of their votes. And so they claimed to free the blacks while literally taking everything away and actually putting them as a strategic barrier from around the white area. Now, some tried to fight back, right? The international community tried to help a little bit. Riots happened, political movements started. You've almost certainly heard of Nelson Mandela, who made a heroic attempt to fight for justice. He tried for 2 decades, leading an opposition party. They followed the MLK style for about 20 years. And eventually he decided that wasn't going to work anymore under some Marxist teachings. He said, I guess the only thing we can do is have a revolution. And so he started trying some violent sabotage and ended up in prison, where he stayed for nearly 30 years before eventually getting released when all this was over and becoming president, which was great. But so all these political movements, all these attempts did not bring, all these social justice attempts did not bring justice to South Africa. So how did it happen eventually? Well, when the Nationalist Party finally fell and Mandela took power, they knew justice had to be done. And most people wanted some form of justice that we talked about here. Either distribute the money or punish people like in the Nuremberg trials or change the laws. And of course, all of those needed to be done. But what they decided to do was, let's form a commission to lead this and to make a decision. It'd have 300 people, and it would be led by someone who they trust to bring justice. And who was that? And the guy Mandela picked, and a great example of leadership, it was actually someone who was his enemy sometimes. But he knew this man cares about justice and gets it in a way nobody else does, and people will follow him. And that man's name was Desmond Tutu. Tutu was born and grew up during apartheid. Brilliant child, became a Christian as a teenager, joined the Anglican Church, became a teacher. He and his wife were teachers when the Nationalist Party took over, and they quit their jobs because they said, we can't do this. And he said, okay, well, I don't want to join a political party. I don't think that's what God would want. Instead, I need to change people's hearts. And so he went to seminary, and he's just one of those dudes. He knows everybody's name. He's super funny. He's a great speaker, and he's got his eye on justice and the target. People loved him. He did a great job of taking the gospel and contextualizing it in what's called an Ubuntu theology. So taking like the local African traditions of hospitality and contextualizing it with the gospel. Fantastic job. And so he rose very, very quickly up to Archbishop, right? He very quickly rose through the ranks of the Anglican Church. And despite their differences, he's the guy that Mandela picked because Mandela said, this guy knows what he's doing and this guy will lead us well. And so the big question is, how would he run the commission? Because there were all of these pressures, as I said, to have a Nuremberg type trial and punish people, or to strip people of their land and property, or whatever. And what Tutu did was he did something that's what I would say is probably the largest example politically where we have seen biblical justice done as a process. Because biblical justice is restorative justice. Biblical justice is not retributive. It is not procedural. And it is not the Robin Hood, redistribution. You may do those things as tools to get you to justice, but they are not themselves justice. Any one of those three will lead you astray. What Desmond Tutu realized is biblical justice is restorative justice, restoring people to the relationship they should have. And I'll give you an example of that from the scripture. You can see this in Isaiah chapter 32, where he talks about the goal of justice. He says, "Then justice will dwell in the wilderness, and the righteousness will abide in the fruitful field. And the effect of righteousness is shalom, and the result of righteousness is quietness and trust forever." Shalom means harmony, everything in the right relationship to God and each other and nature. And what the Bible says is that when justice is done, we are restored to the proper relationships up, sideways, and with nature, okay? With the ground underneath us. The overarching goal that God wants when he talks about justice, and you see this throughout the Bible, is to restore people to the condition they were supposed to be. And of course, you know this if you know the gospel, right? I mean, what does the gospel story tell us? God created the heavens and the earth and us in it, and Adam and Eve, and he created the animals, and everything was in proper relationship to each other. And then because of sin, God is removed from that situation. The relationship between man and God is broken and damaged, but that causes a curse to come. The ground doesn't respond to us. The animals start fighting with each other and with us. The creation falls into bondage to decay. You get the redness of tooth and claw that comes with nature. Everything starts to devolve and fall apart. Relationships with animals, with nature, with each other. You see that in the curse too. Man and woman will fight with each other, and you see our relationship with God broken. Sin breaks those relationships, and God's ultimate goal is to reestablish all of that together, to restore it back to where it was originally at. That's what Jesus came to do, by the way. That was his purpose. The ultimate end of his work is restoring the relationships that we had in the garden. And so within this broad arc of Scripture, that's what we see, okay? So back to Desmond Tutu. He understood this. And he said, okay, I've got to implement this in South Africa. And so he led what was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So despite all of the political pressure, what Tutu said was this. He said, we are going to have a threefold approach: confession, forgiveness, restitution. So first, any of the white nationalists or any of Mandela's party who had broken the law, anyone who did anything wrong could come to publicly confess their crimes on camera in front of the entire nation, and internationally. Everyone could watch this. It happened in the 90s. You could go watch this. You can download some of them today and watch them. They would go and they would openly, anything they confessed was fair game. And they would openly say, here's exactly what I did and why I did it and who I did it to. And they were horrifying, as you might imagine. Tutu often was caught on camera sobbing during it. But if you came and you were willing to honestly and openly confess, then what you would receive is forgiveness. Complete amnesty from the government for your crimes. Forgiveness. And Tutu would encourage the victims to actually make things right too, to forgive. And then the third step, to complete this process of reconciliation, the person who did the confessing would provide restitution. So his personal gain, the things that he had done, he would contribute directly to the victims. Literally his house and lands, literally his money, the things that he had done. They weren't forcibly taken away from him, although you could kind of argue that your you can do this or go to jail. So there's a little bit of force in there. But by and large, they all jumped at the opportunity. We messed up. We are sorry. Here's what we did. And this is going not to the government, to the victims. See, restorative justice is victim-focused justice. That's the goal, is bring the victim back to the condition they were supposed to be in. Now, this got Tutu a lot of negative press. I mean, he didn't exactly try. He wouldn't quote the laws. He would quote scripture. He opened every session with prayer. People were kind of irritated by how overtly Christian he was about it all. And Mandela's party got tarnished a little bit, as some of them admitted some of the things they had done. But ultimately, both Mandela and Tutu were thrilled with how this turned out. And every study has shown that while South Africa still has a ways to go, they have made radical improvements in the last 20 years since this happened. So while it wasn't perfect, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission shows us an example of how justice should be done, focused on restoring people to the relationships they had. Notice that it was not only about restoring the victim to the place that had been stolen from them, it was also about restoring the criminal to the place that he should have been, and then restoring their relationship with each other and with the government. The relationships were central. Victims are the central focus, and how we can get them back to the relationship that they need to have. Justice is not about getting even or even about fixing the system. We may fix the system. We may do distribution in order to get to there, but that's not the goal. And that's not the purpose. The purpose is that the relationships are mended and fixed. It's about restoring what was broken. Now, knowing that, of course, begs a question. If I'm telling you to restore people to something, what do I restore them to? That's what we're going to talk about in our next session. Now, before we go to that, I want to leave you with some breakout questions. I'm going to give you some discussion questions. What's the Young Life term? Cabin questions, right? You're going to have some cabin questions that you can talk about. So these are printed out, I believe. You have hard copies. And so you're going to be given these discussion questions. And before you read them, I want to say this and for the rest of the time. And as you have these discussions, I want to remind you of something. You have to pay for a ticket to a movie, or you have to pay, you have a cost of entry for everything. Being offended is the cost of entry to gospel growth. If you want to grow, you have to be okay with the fact that I'm going to say some things that are going to offend the way you think about the world, and the people in your discussion groups are going to say some things that are going to offend you. And instead of being defensive, when you get offended, you need to stop, set that feeling aside, and say, okay, could they be right here? God, what do you have from them, from their statement, for me to grow on? Because if you don't do that, you'll never grow. Every person I know says that they know they're not a finished product and says they know they're not perfect. But when you get in an argument, they sure act like they know exactly what the answer is, right? You have got to be willing to be offended. So I want you to be willing to be offended as you go into group and you talk to each other and you listen to people different than you. And the questions that I want you guys to ask yourselves in this first cabin session is, first of all, when you think of justice before this talk, do you typically think of punishing people, of redistributing things, of changing policies, or of restoring the victims and their relationships? So that's the first question. Second question, do you feel that political and social justice movements today are victim focused? Maybe some of them you think they are, maybe some of them you think they aren't. Why or why not? Discuss that as a group. Be willing to be offended by each other. Be open with each other, okay? And keep your focus. Be willing to challenge each other when they say something that you don't think is dead on to biblical justice. And thirdly, do you feel that the political and social justice discussions today are focused on restoring relationships? So are they victim focused at all? And if they are they focused on restoring the relationships and healing our nation? Why or why not? I think these are going to be some really good questions. So you guys go out, have these discussions, and then we'll come back when you're done.